Hey everyone, it's Elo. I hope that you're doing well. In today's video, you might be able to tell that we're going to talk about some books. And I have quite a few books in my collection at this point in my life. Especially being an English major, I accumulated quite a number of books over a long period of time. So I decided to choose some of my favorites and some that are just the most have made the biggest impression upon me, and I figured I would just share a little bit about each of them with you, just as, I guess, recommended reading. For those of you who might be curious, I did get my hair cut today. This is not something I can do to myself, so thank you to my stylist Joshua for hooking me up. I did decide to get a little bit of a fringe, which I'm pretty happy and excited about. But yeah, don't expect to see my hair like this again anytime soon. I obviously couldn't waste it though, so here we are. I'm not going to talk about these books in any particular order. They're just however I pulled them from my shelves, and hopefully I will be brief enough to get through them all. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 books to talk about. So let's just go ahead and get started. This is the first book that I wanted to talk about, which is called Their Eyes Were Watching God, and it's written by Zora Neale Hurston, who was a Black woman author who lived from 1891 to 1960. There's a small biography about her on the back. It says, Zora Neale Hurston was a novelist, folklorist, and anthropologist whose fictional and factual accounts of Black heritage remain unparalleled. Her many books include Dust Tracks on a Road, Jonah's Gourd Vine, Mules and Men, Seraph on the Swanee, Moses, Man of the Mountain, and Every Tongue Got to Confess. This is an excellent, excellent book. I thoroughly enjoyed this book, and anytime that a book is vetted by Alice Walker, you've got to know that it's going to be good. The print is pretty large, I guess I would say, so it's a fast read. It's roughly, it's 193 pages, and then there's an afterword and a little chronology in the back. There is, I guess, what we would call sensitive language in this book. They do use the N-word, and there's a lot of dynamics in this book that might not be found in other pieces of writing, but I think that that's all the more reason to educate yourself, to enjoy reading something that's such a cultural piece. And I'm going to read just the little back cover blurb on this as well, which says, one of the most important works of 20th century American literature, Zora Neale Hurston's beloved 1937 classic, Their Eyes Were Watching God, is an enduring Southern love story, sparkling with wit, beauty, and heartfelt wisdom. told in the captivating voice of a woman who refuses to live in sorrow, bitterness, fear, or foolish romantic dreams. It is the story of a fair-skinned, fiercely independent Janie Crawford and her evolving selfhood through 3 marriages and a life marked by poverty, trials, and purpose. A true literary wonder, Hurston's masterwork remains as relevant and affecting today as when it was first published, perhaps the most widely read and highly regarded novel in the entire canon of African American literature. Which, that's a really big statement, but I think this book deserves it. It's a very interesting sort of storytelling style, and I think everyone can learn something from this book. I definitely agree that it's still just as applicable and thought-provoking as it ever was when it was written, even though that was in the 30s. So that's my first recommendation for you. My next is quite different. This is actually a collection of short stories, and it's pretty cool because these were all written and submitted by listeners of this author, Paul Auster, his show on, I believe, NPR. Yep. It's called I Thought My Father Was God, which is a line from one of the stories collected within. Some of them are really short, like half a page, and other ones are a bit longer, but they are all grouped by kind of type, I guess I would say. There are stories on dreams, stories on luck, family, pets, all kinds of coincidences and interesting things that really show kind of just how magical and wondrous life can be, just ordinary life. There's nothing remarkable about these people who wrote these stories. They just have an interesting story to tell. Obviously, there's no real way to vet whether or not all of these stories are 100% true, but the point of this collection was for people to send in true stories that happened to them. The back cover says, "The true life stories in this unique collection provide a window into the American mind and heart. 180 voices, male and female, young and old, from all walks of life and all over the country, talk intimately to the reader. Combining great humor and pathos, this remarkable selection of stories from the thousands submitted to NPR's Weekend All Things Considered National Story Project gives the reader a glimpse of America's soul in all its diversity." And some of the stories in here really were incredibly interesting and cool. And some of them just made you think a little bit. And some of them I didn't really connect with that much, which is fine too. I can remember at least one very, very vividly. I remember a lot of them, but the one that I think stood out to me the most was a story of someone surviving, kind of being almost killed by like a hitchhiker, but ended up surviving. And it's just amazing to like see what people have been through, to hear their stories. I felt like that book came into my life at the right time because it gave me a lot of perspective and really opened me up to... It's a good book to show you how different people are and how different belief systems can be. We're all, in this book, united in being American and growing up in this country. But you can see how clearly different we all are at the same time too, which was incredibly interesting to experience in this way. It was also a very fast read. This book is definitely dense. You have to kind of think a decent bit. You could read it as just a story. It's not dense in the sense that you have to have a PhD to read it. You can be at a lower reading level and read the story just fine. But if you really want to interpret the sort of behind the scenes meanings and get the most value out of this book, you are gonna want to think critically and not read everything at a surface level. On the other hand, this kind of fast read is the kind where you don't really have to be thinking that much. You don't have to have, you can be whomever. You don't even have to like reading really that much to get into this kind of book because the stories are really short, and you can always skip ones if you don't like them. So it's easier to read a book like this if you're not a huge reader. It's a bad time for my leg to fall asleep. I'm trying to ignore it. Okay. So moving on, this next book is actually a graphic memoir called a Bildungsroman, which means a coming-of-age story. The author is kind of going back and talking about her own experience of growing up in Iran during the Islamic Revolution. So this is Marjane Satrapi, and as far as I'm aware, she did all of the ideas for the pictures and whatnot, the actual like comic, and she did all of the dialogue. And this is called Persepolis, the story of a childhood. And this book is a fast read for a whole nother reason, which is that it is like a comic. It's a graphic novel. But even in the pictures themselves, there's a lot to interpret. For example, sometimes you have scenes where the comics are mainly white in the background, and this might depict a little bit of a lightness, a scene that's maybe not as grim, and then you might have some pages where the background is very dark. So she plays a lot with the white and black, even though those are the only two shades she has to work with. You can look at the composition of any square in the entire novel and get some information from that square about more than just what's being said in the dialogue. You can notice how large or small a character's face is. You can see what takes the foreground, what takes the background. So reading a comic, reading a graphic novel is not just pretty pictures and words. There's a lot of subtlety to it if you really care enough to look. And this was hard to read. It's very emotional. I'm particularly sensitive and affected by a lot of the media that I consume. I wouldn't say that this is too dark. It was manageable. There are some things that I've read that were not manageable, but I wouldn't put this on that scale. It is very eye-opening. It teaches you some history if you don't know anything about the Islamic Revolution, if you don't know much about life in Iran or anything like that. I would recommend this. It's very humanizing. It might give you a perspective that you didn't ever think you would have, especially for Americans, especially now that there's so much tension and so few people really understand the distinctions between Islam, Muslim, Iran, Iraq. Like, all of the Middle East kind of gets grouped together and has this bad image or reputation, which is really not fair to the millions of great people who live there. So this is very educational for a lot of different reasons, but it's also an excellent novel. And I don't know, I guess I would just recommend reading it and then maybe getting your own inspiration. Like, what would your coming of age story be like? What would you focus on? It really puts a lot of things into perspective. And that's not her only work. She has other novels that are also really good and really worth reading. Sorry, my leg is still asleep. Okay, next we have a white American classic, which is called Persuasion, written by the late great Jane Austen. This was published in 1818, so it is a very old, by modern reading standards, novel. It is fast. Reading this is very fast, very easy. The print is probably about a medium size, and it's not even 200 pages. If you like things like Downton Abbey, if you enjoy kind of the old English class system and then the subversion of that class system, this is a great book for that reason. On the back it says, Persuasion was Jane Austen's last work. Its mellow character and autumnal tone have long made it a favorite with Austen readers. Set in Somersetshire and Bath, the novel revolves around the lives and love affairs of Sir Walter Elliot, his daughters Elizabeth, Anne, and Mary, and various in-laws, friends, suitors, and other characters. In Anne Elliot, the author created perhaps her sweetest, most appealing heroine. At the center of the novel is Anne's thwarted romance with Captain Frederick Wentworth, a Navy man Anne met and fell in love with when she was 19. At the time, Wentworth was deemed an unsuitable match, and Anne was forced to break off the relationship. 8 years later, however, they meet again. By this time, Captain Wentworth has made his fortune in the Navy and is an attractive catch. However, Anne is now uncertain about his feelings for her. But after various twists and turns of fortune, the novel ends on a happy note. In Persuasion, as in such novels as Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and Emma, Austen limned the plight of young women who could escape the constraints of family life only by marrying, and suggests the foolishness of women who believed they were free and not dependent on the financial and social resources of men. At the same time, Persuasion offers an ironic and subtle pay-in to the true love that enables one woman to rise above straitened economic circumstances and the stifling social conventions that restricted women to narrowly circumscribed lives in the common sitting room. Sure to appeal to admirers of Jane Austen, Persuasion will delight any reader with its finely drawn characters, gentle satire, and charming recreation of the genteel world of 19th century English countryside. So as you could tell from that description, one of the main themes in this book is going to be gender issues, particularly, as it said, women being pigeonholed into a certain life because at this time they were certainly regarded as the property of men, and women didn't have very many options. So economic issues and gender issues and just the pressure of family kind of telling you what to do and who to be and how to live your life are all themes in this book that really stick out. That being said, it might be more of a feminine type book. Not that males can't enjoy this book by any means, but I know that if you're talking about like a classic straight hetero male who is into more masculine things, this might not be up your alley. This would be maybe considered more of a chick flick type of book, but sometimes it's good to read stuff like that and branch away from what you're used to, because not only does it help round out your character and make you more aware of circumstances and emotions and just feelings that you might not have in your life regularly. It's a really great way to understand other people outside of your sphere. And as with all reading, I think that's part of the reason why I love reading books that are not just by white male or white female authors. I love to read from different time periods, different cultures, all kinds of different books, because it helps you understand more about just the human condition and how we relate or how we are different from one another. And this makes you generally a more compassionate and peaceful person. Okay, so speaking of different ethnicities and backgrounds, this next book, called Reservation Blues, is actually written by a Native American author named Sherman Alexie. He is the author of 21 books, and he has won the National Book Award, the Catherine Ann Porter Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Penn Faulkner, Penn Hemingway, and Penn Malamud Awards, and he's won the Stranger Genius Award. He is a performer, director, poet, and screenwriter, and he lives in Seattle. This book is another one that I would say is hard to read for cultural reasons, similarly to Persepolis. So you know, I guess, where I'm coming from. I have never met a Native American person in my life. I know I've had friends throughout my life, or classmates maybe I should call them, who were partially like an eighth, like a 16th, they could trace through a DNA test or whatever, that they had some Native American blood, but I've never met a true Native American person before in my life. And I actually didn't know how many Native Americans are still living, because the only time I've ever really gotten much of an education about them, it's been just to hear all of the horrible, horrifying things that settlers, colonizers did to them. So in my mind, those things were so sad and so horrific that I actually imagined that like 100,000 people were left, which is not true. There are like 6 million or more Native Americans living still in America today. But that just goes to show you how terrible they've been treated. And even though I have zero Native American ties, I've always felt immense sadness, I guess. And I've always thought that if I ever have the means, that Native American people would be the ones who I would want to help somehow. And maybe I'm not capable, maybe they wouldn't want my help, I don't know. But I just think that it's really sad that we've taken, in a lot of countries, the indigenous people and ruined the life that they could have had. And it really shows. And reading this book furthered those feelings for me, because it talks a lot about life on a reservation, and how pathetic the government provided housing is, and it's just really sad to learn that, truthfully, not just in this book, but truthfully, a lot of Native American people are alcoholics. The suicide rate among Native American women specifically is one of the highest out there for any demographic. It's just upsetting, and for that reason I would say this is a hard read. However, it also has a lot of really funny parts in it. It has really interesting language that I've never been exposed to from another author. And yeah, so let me just read the background here. So it says, Sherman Alexie has been hailed as one of the best writers we have. Reservation Blues is his irresistibly stunning debut novel. One day, legendary bluesman Robert Johnson appears on the Spokane Indian Reservation, in flight from the devil, and presumed long dead. When he passes his enchanted instrument to Thomas Builds the Fire, the storyteller, misfit, and musician, a magical odyssey begins that will take them from reservation bars to small-town taverns, from the cement trails of Seattle to the concrete canyons of Manhattan. This is a fresh, luxuriantly comic tale of power, tragedy, and redemption among contemporary Native Americans. It's very interesting. It's kind of got this hint of like voodoo magic almost that is really cool to read from that perspective, and I think it's worth reading. And yes, that character's name is one word, hyphenated, Thomas Builds the Fire. Okay, so moving on to something completely different. This book is written by Timothy Bindley, whom I've never actually seen a picture of, so I don't know what he's like. I don't know his ethnicity. I don't know how old he is. Oh, actually, here's a little blurb. He's Canadian, so there we go, more diversity. Timothy Findlay, who lived from 1930 until 2002, was one of Canada's most compelling and best-loved writers. He is the author of The Wars, which won the Governor General's Award and established him as one of Canada's leading writers, as well as Pilgrim and The Piano Man's Daughter, both finalists for the Giller Prize. His other novels, Headhunter, The Telling of Lies, The Last of Crazy People, The Butterfly Plague, Famous Last Words, which I've read and actually really liked, this one, Not Wanted on the Voyage, and Spadework. He also has a novella called You Went Away, and a short fiction series, Dinner Along the Amazon, Stones, and Dust to Dust. And these have won numerous awards and are well loved both in Canada and internationally. Timothy Findlay was made an officer of the Order of Canada and a Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres. So he is more well known than I knew. I don't actually know how I got turned on to this book. I don't remember if I picked it out at random. It wasn't assigned in class by any means. I read this book quite a number of years ago, and it's really cool. It's largely, I don't know, it's not completely from any one perspective really, but you do spend time inside the mind of a cat named Model. I think that's the perspective I remember the most in the book, but you kind of have a little bit of omniscience as well, because you can hear the humans speak as well, and the cat doesn't really talk. It mainly just observes things, but it also goes through its own stuff. And as you might be able to tell from the cover art a little bit, this is actually a Noah's Ark story. This is a very interesting sort of imagining of what maybe happened when Noah was asked to build the ark for God. And as a lot of you know, I'm not a Christian. I don't believe in God, but that does not in any way stop you from enjoying this story. I don't even know that I would consider this a Christian novel because it is a little crude and doesn't really make God look that good. But I don't think the Bible really always makes God look that good either. So take from that what you will. It's just a story of the Great Flood, and it's kind of really magical and mystical. It's really the only serious book I've ever read that has a character whose perspective is an animal. That's really hard to do well and make work, which is why it often doesn't happen. But it's done beautifully in this book, and it's just such an interesting read. As you can tell, not wanted on the voyage. You can imagine the kind of implications of that, like of all the animals and people who were left behind. They were not wanted on the ark. They were left to drown. It's intense. It's a good story. It's it's just kind of magical in a weird way. And probably one of my favorite books as well. Okay. Next is a book that I pronounced the title of wrong for about 3 weeks before I heard my teacher say it in class. In America, when we see this name, this means Maurice. But in England, which is where this book is from, written by E.M. Forster, this is called Morris. Set in the elegant Edwardian world of Cambridge undergraduate life, this story by a master novelist introduces us to Morris Hall when he is 14. We follow him through public school and Cambridge and into his father's firm. In a highly structured society, Morris is a conventional young man in almost every way, except that he is homosexual. Written during 1913 and 1914, immediately after Howard's End, and not published until 1971. If you could guess, the reason why this novel had to wait 60 years to be published was because it was deemed offensive at the time and illegal in some ways, because being gay was a crime at the time, which is crazy to me. Morris was ahead of its time in its affirmation that love between men can be happy. Happiness, Forster wrote, is its keynote. In Morris, I tried to create a character who was completely unlike myself or what I supposed myself to be. Someone handsome, healthy, bodily attractive, mentally torpid, not a bad businessman, and rather a snob. Into this mixture, I dropped an ingredient that puzzles him, wakes him up, torments him, and finally saves him. This book I read in less than a day. It's 246 pages long. I don't even really know how to summarize this book. This is an emotional book. Even though it says that happiness is the keynote, there is an immense amount of struggle in this book, and sexuality is obviously the large factor that's happening here, and it's almost still relevant in a lot of ways, especially now that there's been this renewed hate in a lot of ways for people who are not straight, and it's hard for people to even admit that they're not straight. So this was a close to home kind of book. It made me read it. Plain and simple. There was no pausing for me. It was something I needed to see to the end. And I think whether or not you are LGBT, whether or not you approve, this is still an amazing read. And like I said, I know that not everything is for everyone, and I know that people are welcome to have their own beliefs. I sincerely hope that people's beliefs don't hurt others who don't believe the same as them or feel the same as them. That's really my only stipulation as to whether or not I will consider someone a good or bad person, really. But reading is such an easy way to get more information about subjects that are not close to you. It's also a great way to get perspective on subjects that are close to you. So try not to close your mind about some of these book options that I'm giving. You don't have to read them, but just think about it, because you might learn something that you would never learn otherwise. And that's really the reason why these are my favorite and most impressionable books, because they are always bound to teach the reader something that they didn't know, even if it's just a feeling at first and takes some amount of time to really put into words. And I don't think anything can be more true about that than this book right here, by Jasmine Ward, who is another Black author. She went to the University of Michigan, and I don't know if she's still working at Tulane, but she was a creative writing professor at Tulane. And this book is amazing. I loved reading this book. It's called Salvage the Bones. As you can see, it's a National Book Award winner as well, for the year 2011. So let me read this little blurb, because I don't even think I can do justice to this book. They heard it on the radio. A hurricane is coming, threatening the town of Bois-Sauvage, Mississippi. Ash's hard-drinking father can feel it in his bones. Ash and her brothers are trying to help prepare, but there are other worries too. Skeeta is watching his prized pit bull, helpless as her new litter dies one by one. Randall, when not preoccupied with basketball, is busy looking after the youngest, Junior. And Ash, 15 and motherless among men, has just realized that she's pregnant. The children of this family have always been short on nurture, but they are fiercely loyal to one another. It is together that they will face the building storm and the day that will dawn after. So this is actually a book about Hurricane Katrina, and it is a fictitious story, but it does show what some of those people in that area were actually having to deal with. Not that this was the exact situation of any family, but there were people who were already going through a lot. And I think that's kind of the point, is that Hurricane Katrina didn't really wait for anyone or discriminate. It attacked and ruined and disrupted and displaced. It really impacted the lives of thousands and thousands of people, some of whom were already poor, already hurting, already dealing with their own loss and their own struggles. This book was incredibly compelling to read. It was interesting. It's told from kind of a poverty-stricken African American vantage point, which again is really something, like some aspects of it I could really relate to, and other ones I would have never thought about. And that's again one of just like the really cool parts about reading, is that you learn stuff and you gain an appreciation and compassion and understanding for parts of life that you might not have even known existed. So it's very easy to read, very fast again. And one of the things that I loved most about it, which was kind of stated on that back cover, is the bond that these siblings have with one another is so strong. And just seeing how that plays out was heartbreakingly awesome. So that would be another great option. And then kind of circling back to England and the gentry and British ways of life, which I don't know anything about really, except for what I've read and what I've seen on television. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this because I feel like it makes me, I don't even know what, I don't know if basic is the right word, or weird, but I guess I would consider myself to be an Anglophile in some ways, which, if you don't know what that means, it's essentially someone who really likes English or British stuff. So like an audiophile, audio, things you listen to, someone who really likes music and things, which I think I would consider myself. I think a lot of us can consider ourselves audiophiles for our love of ASMR as well, sound related. So Anglophile, like Anglo-Saxon, ANGLO, that is the kind of propensity for really enjoying British things. And I think it really just stemmed out of like cultural stuff that I would see on TV growing up. London has always looked like a very aesthetically pleasing place to me. I like that grayed out look. I like the history that's there. I was always fascinated by the Industrial Revolution growing up. That's one of the few parts of history that really interested me very strongly. And I like seeing the old pictures and the cobblestone, and just, I feel like the UK, in the fact that it's so old in a lot, like more than America by a long shot, it just has a lot of, I guess, charm, just some sort of vibe that we don't really have here, and I find it to be pleasing. I know not everyone likes that look. Again, I have no idea what it's like to actually be there. I've never left America, so it could stink. I could not like it, but God, when I see London and then when I see pictures of like the English countryside, it's beautiful. Like, I know that to people who live in the UK, a 30-minute drive or an hour drive is a lot, but for me, I've lived somewhere where it took 30 minutes just to get to the grocery store. So I would be diggity down to drive even 2 hours to get to some of those scenic pastures and stuff out there. I really don't think I would ever leave. So one day I really plan on visiting London, visiting the English countryside. If you're currently living in the UK and you have some places that you think would be worth me seeing, or foods worth trying, or anything like that, I'm always interested. Feel free to drop that below. Same goes with everything I'm talking about. I'm not Native American, I'm not Black, I'm not Indian, I'm not Islam. I am interested in all of these cultures. Everyone's life is interesting to me in that way. So if you have any recommendations about things that you think I'm probably not aware of, feel free to let me know. That's kind of what we're doing here, right? I'm showing you books you might not know, so feel free to reciprocate kindly. I'm not trying to offend anyone, so I would appreciate you forgiving my lack of knowledge in the things that I have no experience in. So this is by Virginia Woolf, with 2 O's, which I've always thought was pretty interesting. And this book is called Mrs. Dalloway. It was made into a movie, which I've never seen, but if it's anything like the book, it's probably a pretty good movie. And the cover here says, Mrs. Dalloway was the first novel to split the atom. If the novel before Mrs. Dalloway aspired to immensities of scope and scale, to heroic journeys across vast landscapes, with Mrs. Dalloway, Virginia Woolf insisted that it could also locate the enormous within the everyday. That a life of errands and party giving was every bit as viable a subject as any life lived anywhere. And that should any human act in any novel seem unimportant, it has merely been inadequately observed. The novel has an art form. The novel as an art form has not been the same since. Mrs. Dalloway also contains some of the most beautiful, complex, incisive, and idiosyncratic sentences ever written in English, and that alone would be reason enough to read it. It is one of the most moving, revolutionary artworks of the 20th century. I know that sounds like a big description, but I agree wholeheartedly. I've read hundreds of books. This was revolutionary, especially for the fact that this is a female author. This book is almost like scrambles your mind. It plays with time, it plays with space. It's incredibly interesting, even though, like it says, it's about a very common, ordinary life, which the little blurb for that, in this vivid portrait of one day in a woman's life. This is one day in this whole book. Clarissa Dalloway is preoccupied with the last-minute details of party preparation, while in her mind she is much more than a perfect society hostess. As she readies her house, she is flooded with faraway remembrances, and, met with the realities of the present, Clarissa re-examines the choices she has made, hesitantly looking ahead to growing old. Undeniably triumphant, this is the inspired, novelistic outline of human consciousness. It is what you would consider like a train of thought type story. Let's see. "194 pages, medium print. And really, it just kind of takes everything, and it's almost like thinking. You know how when you watch a TV show or a movie and there are these massive time gaps, you're like, okay, well, what happened to the rest of the day? And that wouldn't have taken that long, or that could have taken longer. This is almost like reading something in real time, because it's just one day, but it's under a microscope, and you talk about, or you hear about, kind of someone's complete inner workings throughout that day. Not just what the character's doing, but like what the character's thinking, and then what comes of that thought and that thought and that thought. But it's not really hard to follow, so don't be intimidated if that sounds really sketchy and weird. It's very gripping and interesting and cool. This book, on the other hand, called Sorry by Gail Jones. This is a really easy, I think, read. So, Sorry is set in the remote outback of Western Australia during World War II, where an English anthropologist and his wife raise a lonely child, Perdita. Her upbringing is far from ordinary. In a shack in the wilderness, with a self-absorbed father burying himself in books, and an unstable mother whose obsession with Shakespeare forms the backbone of the girl's limited education. Emotionally adrift, Perdita becomes friends with a deaf, mute boy, Billy, and a forsaken Aboriginal girl, Mary. Perdita and Mary come to call one another sister, and to share a profound bond. The three misfit children are content with each other and their life in this distant corner of the world, until a terrible event lays waste to their lives. Through this compelling story of Perdita's childhood, Gail Jones explores the values of friendship, loyalty, and sacrifice with a brilliance that has earned her numerous accolades. So, here we are in Australia. I think the only region that we're not gonna go to in these books is like Asia, in terms of China and Japan. I don't think I've actually read a whole lot of literature. I'm trying to think. I'll have to dig, but I can't really remember reading very many books that are set in China or Japan or have Chinese or Japanese authors. So maybe that's something I need to look into as well. But this book makes you feel stuff that you didn't expect to feel, and it's not particularly like political or controversial. It's more like internal and dealing with, I guess, like upbringing, really, and how messed up that can be, and the kind of almost the things that we do to survive or to feel like we belong, stuff like that, as we're working our way through our childhood, which can be a very weird and hard time. Yeah, I really enjoyed this book. I love that the pages are not perfect on the edges. They're not even all the same size, really. And I don't know if that's just this copy that I got or if it's all like that. But yeah, it's a different location. I've never read another book set in the Australian outback. It's very barren feeling, and she does a really good job of like using her words to, oh, you can see here, I forgot there was a picture, you can see here how just dusty and how there's really nothing there, where they are anyway. And Gail Jones just does a really good job of using her words to bring you to that place and that image. And it's almost like she creates a scene that's so vivid that you don't just see it, you feel it emotionally. It makes you have a reaction. So that had to make the list for that reason. Okay, this is just like beyond, I don't even know. This is a collection of short stories. It looks like nine short stories in here, and these are by Jhumpa Lahiri, which she is another Indian author, and you can see that influence in just about every story. This was the 2000 Pulitzer Prize winning book. It's just a fiction collection, and oh man, these stories are so good. Each one you're kind of like sad when it ends, because she creates these little worlds that you get really absorbed into very quickly, and you feel like you know the characters really quickly. Obviously it's excellent considering it won the Pulitzer Prize. I don't really need to tout it that much. But yeah, Jhumpa Lahiri was born in 1967 in London, England, and then she was raised in Rhode Island. The recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, which is a high award. She is also the author of a novel, The Namesake, and she currently lives in New York City. And I believe since this time she's had Unaccustomed Earth, I think, was her other collection. And darn, I can't remember the name of it, but I think there's a book also. I think it's by her. It's a book where the main character has synesthesia, which is where your senses, when you're born, your senses are not wired correctly, essentially. So she can taste words. Not that every word has a taste, but a lot of words make her brain think she has a certain taste in her mouth, if that makes sense. And it's a really interesting read. So I recommend her as an author in general. This collection of short stories is excellent. I really don't think I need to, like I said, say too much about it, because it's kind of sells itself, and I can't really be more persuasive than a Pulitzer. But it's really good. I'm gonna leave this one for last, and we'll go to, okay. If you don't know who Toni Morrison is, she is an African-American authoress, queen, who has written some of the hands-down best novels of all time. I did like a huge report about her in school, really big paper, because she's one of my like biggest inspirations. In my opinion, in a lot of people's opinion, one of the best writers to have ever lived. She fought a lot for what she believed in. She broke a lot of barriers. She dealt with a lot of the common issues that African American women particularly have to deal with, especially within her own race. She talks a lot about kind of the issues with African American men keeping women kind of down. And you really kind of get to realize how disadvantaged in a way that can be. And I don't mean that in a negative way, just like statistically speaking, it is much harder to be a black female than anything else. And Sula is a story that I think helps showcase a lot of very, very interesting and complicated qualities of life, I guess. So the blurb for this says, 2 girls who grow up to become women. 2 friends who become something worse than enemies. In this brilliantly imagined novel, Nobel Prize laureate Toni Morrison tells the story of Nell Wright and Sula Peace, who meet as children in the small town of Medallion, Ohio. Their devotion is fierce enough to withstand bullies and the burden of a dreadful secret. It endures even after Nell has grown up to be a pillar of the black community, and Sula has become a pariah. But their friendship ends in unforgivable betrayal. Or does it end? Terrifying, comic, ribald, and tragic, Sula is a work that overflows with life. I guess that's a better way to put it than what I said. There's just a lot of qualities of life in here that aren't really talked about otherwise, and she does such a good job of making them powerful and almost unbelievable or majestic in a way, but terrifying at the same time. It's such an interesting mix, but it really, in my opinion, that's why it is so good at conveying the human condition, so to speak, because that kind of is life. It's like, it's tragic and horrifying, but at the same time it's very magical and almost unbelievable. So yeah, this was one of my favorite books. I recommend reading anything by Toni Morrison, really. I even recommend reading about Toni Morrison because she's super dope as a human being. So I've got 2 more here for you. They're very different. The one that I've saved for last is actually my favorite book series, pretty much of all time, and it's the only more modern, it's the most modern, I would say, of everything I've presented. So other than maybe like Salvage the Bones, which obviously happened after Katrina, so not that long ago. This one was long ago. This is the novel Frankenstein, which was written by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. The Wollstonecraft is important because there's also a Mary Shelley, and a lot of these old white dudes, okay, this is not a dude. Mary Shelley is a girl. Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley was a woman, but her hubs, Senor Shelley, a lot of he and a lot of his friends in the writing sphere, they boogied down with just about everybody. A lot of them had like diseases and would sleep with a lot of women and their daughters and their friends, and it was just a good old time for them. So Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley is like a boss among bosses because she wrote one of the most famous and awesome, thrilling novels, and she was up against all of these dudes who they pretty much, her contemporaries pretty much make up the canon of British literature, especially British romantic literature. That was the time period in which they were doing their thing, and not just that way, but also in literature. They did prose, they did poetry. They're the dead old white guys who make up the classic canon, which, if you don't know what the canon is, it's not the gun with a cannonball. That's C-A-N-N-O-N. This is C-A-N-O-N, just one N. And it essentially means like the group of works that have been agreed upon as being the ones that should be taught, the ones that are worth learning from, passed down year after year after year. So having all of this literature by other people, especially people who are not male, especially people who are not white, is huge, and is disrupting the canon as we speak, and that's really cool. But yes, she is a boss for writing this novel, to the point where a lot of people thought that a man actually wrote this, and like her husband, maybe Percy Shelley, wrote this and let her sign it under her own name, to give her credit, which is typical, I guess, but not true. She did write this herself, and I have not connected with a piece of literature the way that I did with this one, except for maybe 4 or 5 times in my life. This is so much more than what the movies make it out to seem like. Frankenstein is his name is Dr. Victor Frankenstein. He is the fool who created the monster, who is known as Frankenstein's monster. A lot of you probably know this, but a lot of people don't know that. The monster's name is not Frankenstein. His father's name is Frankenstein. He's never named. He is rejected thoroughly by his creator, and this is an incredibly sad story, and I didn't know when I started reading it that I was going to really connect with the monster in this book, and I did. Even though he's called a monster in mainstream, he's actually more rightfully dubbed the creature, because monster has this really negative connotation, and he is not a negative guy whatsoever. The creature is soft and lovable and a misfit, and if you feel like a misfit, if you feel rejected by your parents, if you have those kinds of same like issues, I guess, that I do, this is an excellent read. It's very emotional, just really well written, even though it's old. Let me see if it says when it was. 1818. So it's about as old as Persuasion, and it's not hard to read though. A lot of them have been modernized. I recommend getting one like this that's closer to the original, I guess. It's really not that difficult to read, but yeah, it's super interesting. super cool. It's also has a subtitle that's The Modern Prometheus. And if you're an English nerd, it's really interesting to look into that title and draw the parallels. That's actually what I did my term paper on in one of my classes. I think it was, shoot. I don't know, some kind of British literature class. It wasn't British romantic literature, it was a different Brit Lit class that I took. And I had a huge essay. I had a paper like this big with all of my ideas linking this story to Prometheus, and that was cool. But for those of you who aren't that nerdy, this is just a really good book, super worth reading, very thrilling and interesting. Last but certainly not least, this is book 1 to a long series that is often called the Alphabet series or the Kinsey Milhone Detective series. This is called, as you can see, A is for Alibi, and all of the books are named like that. B is for Burglar, C is for Corpse, and so on. Very, very sadly, Sue Grafton, the authoress of these books, recently passed away. God, I guess it's been a year now, at least. But I try not to think about it because it kind of breaks my heart. She battled cancer and passed away. And she was working on C, which, would have been the last book of the series. So, as her daughter says, the alphabet ends in Y now. And I love every single one of these books. It's, like I said, my favorite series. Sometimes when I get a book hangover, like I finish reading a book and I'm really depressed, I'll restart this series and read it through all the way. The main character of this series is Kinsey Milhone, and she is a private detective, a PI, who is really like a lone wolf. She reminds me a lot of myself. She's frugal, she's kind of no nonsense. She is funny though. She has kind of my same sort of like dry sense of humor. She has a couple like steamy tangles that she gets into every now and then, and she's just a badass, really. Like, not in like a James Bond kind of way, but just in like the fact that she faces what comes at her to the best of her ability. And she's very human. She's not extravagant. She's not gonna, do some crazy slide across the floor and blows up a grenade and, shoot somebody dead in between the eyes. Like, she's very realistic about the dangers of her job. But she also, she was a cop. This isn't spoiler information, by the way. Every single book is different. Every one is a different entry that she's writing in retrospect about a case that she just worked. So she was a cop for a while, but she didn't like having to kind of answer to other people and do a lot of paperwork. And she's also a little bit of like a rule breaker. She does a lot of breaking and entering, and she doesn't necessarily follow the law to a T. So yeah, she's a really, really cool character. It's a lot of fun to get into her headspace, to follow her on her work. And honestly, some of them are really like they'll get your pulse going when the action starts to close in. If she's coming in on a murderer or like a really intense scene, which usually happens towards the end of each book, because she's working through solving it for the most part. It'll really, I mean, sometimes I get a little scared reading some of these, even though it's like my 4th or 5th or 6th time reading them. I can still get a little like anxious about it because they're just that well written. You can really imagine yourself there, and yeah, I cannot recommend this series enough. Whether you're male, female, whatever, it's like my favorite mystery series. Even though the grouping that I showed you today might not seem like it, mystery is actually like my favorite stuff to read. So if you have any great, not too scary reading material in the mystery genre, please let me know that below too. I'm totally interested in checking that out. And don't forget that it costs nothing to get a library card, and you probably have a library near you even if you don't know it. Might be in walking distance, or maybe you can take public transportation or your own transportation if you have, and you can check out books for free. You can travel to all sorts of worlds, all different cultures. I know that some people think reading is kind of hard, or they feel like they can't focus enough to read, but it's kind of a skill that you can develop over time, and it's really useful to be able to read. I used to only be able to read in quiet areas, and yeah, sometimes I even had those situations where I would read a page 5 or 6 times and have no idea what I read. That still happens to me if I'm tired enough and I need to go to sleep. I cannot absorb what I'm reading, so that's normal, and don't let that deter you. You kind of just have to work through that. And now I've gotten to the point where I can read literally anywhere. I can read in the middle of a loud mall. I could probably read in a burning room. Nothing bothers me anymore because I narrow into the story and I kind of play it in my head like a movie or like a TV show. You just have to get your imagination kind of activated, and I definitely recommend, if you're ever reading a new story, a new book, to maybe start that off in more favorable conditions until you really get into it and get attached to the characters and to what's going on. Once you're really in there and wanting to know what happens next, it's like binge watching a TV show. Like you have to pick that book up, you have to keep reading, and you have to know what happens next. And I promise that that can happen for you, even if you haven't been a long-term reader in your life up until this point. I would say just give it a shot. These are all great books to start with. Pick one that you think sounds interesting to you if you don't know where to start. You can also do some Googling. You can go to your local library and just read the first couple pages of a bunch of books. It's a good date idea too, or friend date idea. You can go with your loved one, with your children, with your friends, and a lot of libraries nowadays have little cafes in them too. You can get something to drink, coffee or whatever, and just go to your favorite section, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, mystery, romance, comedy, whatever you love, whatever you think you'd like, and start reading. Just try a few things out. Read the flap, read the first couple pages of the chapter, see if you can get into it. Some of these books I bought at random from a sale bin at like a thrift store, just because I read the first couple pages and thought that sounds pretty good, and they've turned into my favorite books of all time. So give it a try. It's a really inexpensive hobby that can gain you so much in life. So there's my little PSA slash hurrah for reading, I guess, that I feel compelled to do. And whether or not you end up reading more or reading any of these, I hope that you enjoyed this video and this little chat about these books. I enjoyed sharing them with you, of course, and I hope to see you in my next video. Okay,